In my last video, I talked about the systemic oppression of black men worldwide. It was difficult for me to talk about. It was difficult for some of you all to hear about. Nonetheless, it is true, and it is truth that we need to know. We can never change our situation until we face the truth head on. And in this video, I'll continue unpacking the fact that around the world, black men are on the bottom. Stay with me. Hello, everybody. I am attorney Augustus Corbett, one half of the Defiant Lawyers. And each and every week, we bring you at least one legal analysis of some trending story regarding politics, policies, personalities, or pop culture to empower you with the information you need to defy this unjust legal system and to nullify systemic racism. If that interests you, and I certainly hope it does, please like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell so you'll get notified every time we upload one of these videos. So yes, last week in my last video, I talked about the systemic oppression of black men around the world, globally. And I heard from a couple of you. Some of you said it was depressing. Some of you doubt that is even true. Well, regarding the depression part of it, yes, I agree. It is not good news, and it can be very depressing. When I talk about it, when I look at these things, when I study this, it is really certainly not something that I want to hear either. It is, it brings you kind of down a little bit to just know that you're a member of a group of people, the people who are on the bottom around the world. That is just not something that any of us want to hear about, and many of us don't even know. And that's because a lot of us, we just think we're just sort of caught in this American bubble. And that's all we know. And that's really all we want to know. But if you don't get anything else from this video, I want you to understand that you are part of a much bigger picture. You are a descendant of a huge continent of black people who are around the world, not just on the continent of Africa, but are around the world. You have African brothers on the continent of Africa. You have African brothers on the European continent, on the Asian continent, on and on and on. And it is to our favor, it is to our advantage that we think of ourselves as members of a larger diaspora. So think internationally, think globally. While we absolutely need to be fully engaged with what's happening here in America, especially right now in this election cycle, we also need to be fully engaged with what's happening outside this country. Because the truth of the matter is, we're not minorities. We are part of a larger majority. But in order to appreciate that fact, you can't think of yourself as being solely from Louisiana, because your folks did not come here via Louisiana. Your folks came here from the west coast of Africa, most likely. Nigeria, Cameroon, Ghana, Togo, or one of the countries that's even further on the western side of the continent of Africa. And that is a fact, and it's something for me that I am very, very happy about. I am absolutely proud to be a descendant of the continent of Africa. I'm a Pan-Africanist and have been so for 40 years. Now, unfortunately, the continent of Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, where our people are from, is not doing well. And that's what we're going to talk about today in part 2. Now, you recall last week, I went through a bunch of statistics showing that in America, black men are on the bottom. I know you don't want to hear that, but in terms of education, in terms of economics, we're on the bottom. So we got to come to grips with that. The only other group of men who come close to where we are, our status, are Native American men. Native American men are also located on the bottom. But when you stack us up against white men, Asian men, Latino men, again, we and Native American men are right there about in the same place in terms of our social status, in terms, again, of our economics, education, political power, and so on. It's not what you want to hear. And if you think about it anecdotally, I understand that it's difficult for you to receive because you're probably middle class. The people that you know are middle class or even upper middle class. Some of you are even wealthy. But those are anecdotes, meaning those are people and situations that you know about on a personal level. What I'm talking about and drawing your attention to is the United States at large. The 40 million African American people or so, and when you look at the percentages of where we are on the socioeconomic status as a whole, we're on the bottom. Now, we can't fix that until we face that. In order to fix something, we got to face it. We got to look at it and ask the hard questions and do the hard work to get off the bottom and to elevate and to rise, right? But first, before you can cure an illness, you got to get to the root of it. You got to take a hard look at it. It doesn't do a sick person any good to avoid going to the doctor, knowing that there's a growth the size of a pineapple on the side of his head. He got to go and get that looked at, right? I know it's not pleasant, but do not ignore where we are, again, on the socioeconomic ladder here in America. We own less than 3% of this nation's wealth. Less than 3% of this nation's wealth, although we've been on this continent at least 400 years. All right, now, with all that said, we're going to look now at how African people are doing on the continent of Africa. And we're going to specifically look at a region of Africa called Sub-Saharan Africa, the Sub-Saharan part of Africa. All right, let's go to another screen. Now, do remember that we define systemic oppression, by the way, as institutionalized racial discrimination where African Americans especially face consistent disadvantages due to bias structures, systems, patterns, and practices in society, and whites experience advantages. That definition can be applied to Africa. Systemic racial oppression is institutionalized racial discrimination where African people especially face consistent disadvantages due to biased structures, systems, patterns, and practices in society, and whites experience advantages. Now, of course, Africa is different. The experience of the African people is very much different from ours in that what we've dealt with is slavery and the stigma of slavery in Jim Crow, whereas they have dealt with colonialism and the stigma and consequences of colonialism. And just in case you may not understand the big differences there, with colonialism, Europeans literally went to the continent of Africa and carved it up, and various European nations took various parts of the African continent. That happened around 1884, 83, during what's known as the Conference of Berlin. Again, where the European nations sat around with a map and carved up that map. And the British said, we'll take this part. The French said, we'll take this part. The Portuguese said, we'll take this part. And they all then went to Africa and began to rob those nations of their valuable, precious minerals and resources, etc. That's what they dealt with on the continent of Africa. We, of course, were kidnapped and forcefully and violently brought here to America, where we were subsequently enslaved for 246 years. So our experience is somewhat different, but systemic oppression is still the immediate cause of a lot of what we deal with, both here in America as well as on the continent of Africa. Okay, now, so conditions in sub-Saharan Africa, around 200 million people. This is the beginning of a UN report, again, that was, motivated by the George Floyd lynching. So they came up with this report and this resolution, and I want to read some of this to you. Around 200 million people identifying themselves as being of African descent live in the Americas. Many millions more live in other parts of the world outside of the African continent. Whether as descendants of the victims of the transatlantic slave trade or as more recent migrants, they constitute some of the poorest and most marginalized groups. You see, that's just the facts. It's just the facts that we have to look at, that the 200 or so million people of African descent who live in the Americas, and then the many more who live around the world, we are some of the poorest and most marginalized groups on planet Earth. I know you don't want to hear that. I don't like that. I don't like hearing that. But I'm more interested in trying to change that. Therefore, I look at that and I let it impact me. I want to feel it because I want to be motivated to do something about it. But before I can, I have to look at it. Hey everyone, I am attorney Augustus Corbett, one half of the Defiant Lawyers. Recently, I took a look at our analytics and I noticed something shocking. Many of you watch our videos and I believe you enjoy them, but you haven't subscribed yet. What are you waiting for? Again, I was shocked because I know our content is empowering and informative. Plus, our 2024 goal is to have 150,000 subscribers before the end of the year. Please help us by hitting that subscribe button, especially you young folks. We particularly want to increase our number of young subscribers. Thanks for all your continued support. We appreciate it very much. So again, sadly and unfortunately, the African diaspora around the world are among the poorest and the most marginalized groups of people on the planet. In fact, we are the poorest. The African diaspora is the poorest on the planet. Now, I know that there are some African people, some African descendant people who are very wealthy. A few are even billionaires. But like I told someone on our channel who mentioned to me about all the millionaires and several billionaires that are of African descent. Well, I had to inform this gentleman that Nike has more capitalization than all the millionaires and billionaires in America combined. Just one corporation. In fact, just one man, Elon Musk, has more money than all the rich black people in this country, and probably rich black people around the world. Just one white dude. So yes, there are some fabulously rich black people, but in comparison to where we should be and what we should have, considering the fact that we are descendants of the richest continent on the planet, we are not to be proud of a few black folks having some money. At least I'm not. I don't know about you. I'm certainly not. Until we get our fair share, until we control the wealth that God gave us. All right? So it's just a fact. We are the poorest and most marginalized people on the planet. For centuries, people of African descent were marginalized as part of the legacy of slavery and colonialism. There is a growing consensus that racism and racial discrimination have caused people of African descent to be held back in many aspects of public life. They have suffered exclusion and poverty and are often invisible in official statistics. There has been progress, but the situation persists to varying degrees in many parts of the world. The murder of George Floyd on 25 May 2020 in Minnesota, United States of America, the mass protests that ensued in many countries, and the momentous verdict against one responsible law enforcement official represent a seminal moment in the fight against racism. Despite Candace Owens trying to annihilate the memory and legacy of the lynching of George Floyd, his death again sent shockwaves throughout the country. The worldwide mobilization of people calling for racial justice has forced a long-delayed reckoning with racism and shifted debates towards a focus on the systemic nature of racism and the institutions that perpetrate it. Prompted by this groundswell, on 17 June 2020, the Human Rights Council held an urgent debate on current racially inspired human rights violations, systemic racism, police brutality, and violence against peaceful protests. So his death, his lynching, really got Black people around the world moving. So I hope his family finds some solace in that, despite the mean-spirited attack on him that Candace Owens did to try to quell and tamp down a racial reckoning here in America. On 19 June 2020, the Council adopted Resolution 43-1 by consensus, in which it requested the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to prepare a report on systemic racism, violations of international human rights law against Africans and people of African descent by law enforcement agencies, especially those incidents that resulted in the death of George Floyd and other Africans and people of African descent, to contribute to accountability and redress for victims, to examine government responses to anti-racism peaceful protests, including the alleged use of excessive force against protesters, bystanders, and journalists, and to present a comprehensive report to the Council at its 47th session. So the world took note because of George Floyd's lynching. That brings a smile to my face because we all witnessed what happened to him. And again, we saw that ugly, awful attack on Mr. Floyd by Candace Owens. But it was too late. It was too late because people had already emotionally connected to his lynching. And I want you to see, too, that this paper and that resolution is for Africans and people of African descent. That includes us. That includes me. That includes you. So again, I want to stress that you have to think of yourself beyond America, not just an American citizen, but a citizen of the world, which means not only do we have civil rights, we also have human rights, just because of us being members of the human family. And again, we are part of a larger group of people of African descent. And we need to unite and stand together and fight our common enemies. So this, for example, this diaspora war between some African Americans and Africans, you know how African Americans say things like, I'm an American, I don't want anything to do with Africa. And how some Africans don't want anything to do with us African Americans. That is playing right into the oppressor's hands. That is precisely what he wants us doing so that we can be divided and therefore conquered. We are descendants of the same continent. We are brothers and sisters. We are cousins. We are of the same bloodline. So we shouldn't be having these wars with each other, fighting over things that really are not relevant. We need to be united so that we can fight against our common enemy, which is systemic oppression. And I'm going to show you the causes of systemic oppression probably in part 3. This is going to be a multi-part because I don't think I'm going to get to the causes today. All right, let's go back. The submissions and consultations highlighted that people of African descent face interconnected, intersectional, and compounded forms of racial discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion that are shaped by historical legacies and mutually reinforced through cycles of structural inequalities that have lasted for generations, affecting the enjoyment of human rights in every part of life. Systemic racism persists in large part due to misconceptions that the abolition of slavery, the end of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans, and colonialism, and measures taken by states to date. Now, the word states here in the international context means nations. Taken by states to date have removed the racially discriminatory structures built by those practices and created equal societies. So they're saying here that some people around the world have the misconception that because slavery was abolished, therefore racial discrimination, systemic racism were also abolished. That would be wrong. We very much still deal with the stigma of slavery. And our African brothers still deal with the stigma of colonialism. And not just the stigma of slavery and colonialism, but the residue, the continued inequalities that they both produce. Africa still reels from colonialism and neo-colonialism, or a new style of colonialism, where African leaders, many of them are corrupt, and they allow European countries to rob their nations, to rob their people, so long as they and or their tribes are prospering. That's sort of the new form of colonialism. And we in America, we blacks in America, we also still deal with the stigma and the consequences and the residue of slavery. Now, white people, black conservatives, what do they say? That's behind us. That's behind us. Ben Carson told a group of white people, that's not, you didn't do anything that bad. I mean, slavery is not all that. Ben Carson, as smart as he is one foolish man. He's one foolish man to think that. And we're talking about a man that my children, I used to have my kids to read his books and to look up to him like a role model. And here he is absolving slavery. Anyway, this report goes on to say, stark economic and political marginalization shapes the lives of people of African descent in many states or countries. In countries where there are sizable communities of people of African descent, the members of these communities are more likely, listen carefully, to live in or to be vulnerable to poverty. African descendants are more likely to live in or be vulnerable to poverty, more likely than other people groups, suffer disproportionately high unemployment rates, earn lower wages, occupy less skilled positions. They are more likely to lack access to adequate housing and to live in segregated, disadvantaged, and hazardous neighborhoods. In several countries, they also suffer disproportionately from environmental pollution and lack of access to clean water. In some instances, measures relating to citizenship and immigration status have reportedly resulted in discriminatory outcomes for some people of African descent. Despite some formal measures to protect land rights, People of African descent continue to experience displacement, dispossession of their land, exclusion and expropriation of their lands in some countries. This is not just talking about African people on the continent of Africa. It's not just talking about African American people. This is talking about people of African descent around the world. These are the things that we deal with collectively. And oh, by the way, someone mentioned in the last video, Thomas Sowell. And I've made very clear my feelings about Thomas Sowell and the other black conservatives. The solutions they offer African Americans and the absolution they offer to white supremacists make no sense, especially when you get outside the bubble of America. In other words, welfare policies, liberalism are not the root causes of all the issues that we just read about in this UN report. Those are not even the real issues that we face here in America, us African Americans. So those sort of short-sighted and again, solutions that offer absolution to white supremacists, in the words of the young people, they can miss me with that. I absolutely know better. Okay? Now, let's get to some numbers. How bad is it actually for sub-Saharan African people? It is really bad. Here we go. Now, when you look at this table, I have highlighted in yellow sub-Saharan Africa. And notice where it is on this list of other regions of the world. It's on the bottom. Just like I said, it's on the bottom. Sub-Saharan Africa is on the bottom. Eastern and Southern Africa, Western and Central Africa. From one coast of the continent to the other end of the continent, those people are on the bottom. Our people. Our brothers. This table shows the number of poor in the millions. And notice for sub-Saharan Africa, it's 397.4 million, which is way more than almost every other region, twice as much as South Asia. There it is. That's 2017. Here's the proof. When I said that we're on the bottom around the world, I wasn't saying that based on my opinions. I know the facts. I know the facts. And here they are. Let me show you another graph. The region that has the highest number of people living below the international poverty line is sub-Saharan Africa, which again is made up of primarily black Africans like we are. And notice the share of the global poor living below the international poverty line in sub-Saharan Africa is way beyond all the rest. Way beyond. Absolutely way beyond everyone else. You just got to ask yourself, why is this the case? And the immediate cause, as I said earlier, is systemic oppression. Can you see that our interconnectedness with the continent of Africa cannot be overstated? Because we deal with those same dynamics here. And why? Because we deal with those same people here. People primarily of European descent, but not just people of European descent. Because as I said, black folks are on the bottom on all these continents. It is shameful, for example, the way Chinese people treat blacks who are in China. It is shameful how the French people treat the blacks who are in France, how the Brits treat the blacks who are in Britain. On and on and on the bottom, wherever we are, because of systemic oppression. Now, before leaving this part of the world, as I said, the European people have been atrocious to us as African people, but so have Arabs. In fact, the Arab people were the first to enslave black people. That enslavement began, well, let's read this. We're reading from the Fair Planet website, which is a nonprofit organization that fights poverty and racism, etc. Forgotten slavery, the Arab-Muslim slave trade. Over the years, global focus and discourse on slavery has concentrated on the transatlantic trade that featured American and European merchants. One other trade has, however, remained largely ignored and at times has been treated as a taboo subject, despite being a key component of African history owing to the devastating impact it has had on the continent, its generations, and its people way of life. The Arab-Muslim slave trade, also known as the Trans-Saharan trade or Eastern slave trade, is noted as the longest slave trade, having occurred for more than 1,300 years, while taking millions of Africans away from their continent to work in foreign lands in the most inhumane conditions. Slavery here lasted 246 years. But Arab-Muslim slavery of black people lasted 1,300 years. And, truthfully, it continues. It started back in the 7th century. And it remained until, again, like very recent. Very, very recent. I remember when pictures and videos came out in 2017 about how the nation of Libya was currently still enslaving black people. I saw a bunch of black men who were slaves, enslaved by the Libyan people. Yet we don't hear much about that slave trade. We don't hear much about it. Typically what we hear about is the European slave trade, and it was, in terms of numbers, the European slave trade was the worst. It went on again for quite some amount of time, and it was vicious, it was atrocious, and so forth. But so is the Arab-Muslim slave trade. So my point with that is, in the Arab nations, black folks are not looked upon with any more favor than they are in America, in Asia, Europe, etc. And I see a lot of African American people who go hard for the Arab community. People like Mark Lamont Hill, who is really, really fighting hard for the Palestinian people. And all of us should be outraged anytime there is any sort of suffering anywhere. But what I would love to see African American people do more of is go hard for the continent of Africa, for all the wars that are in Africa that are affecting the lives of our people. That's what I would like to see. Because not only are they our people, but they're on the bottom of these other nations. This article goes on to say, scholars have christened it a veiled genocide, attributing the tagline to the most humiliating and near-death experience slaves were subjected to, from capture in slave markets to labor fields abroad and the harrowing journey in between. While officials figure on the exact number of slaves captured from Africa in the Trans-Sahara trade are contested, most scholars put the estimate at about 9 million. And based on my research, what the Arab Muslim slave traders would do is castrate a lot of the African men and sell the African women into sex trafficking. So we may not want to look at it, but yes, we're on the bottom around the world. Around the world. And like many of you, of course, it makes me very angry and it's sad. And incidentally, the extreme poverty level is $2.15. So a lot of the people in sub-Saharan Africa live on less than $2.15 per day. Which brings me to this data. 85% of Africa lives on less than $5.50 a day, according to the World Bank. More African females attend college than African males. In East Asia and Pacific, there have been drastic changes in the distribution of the population across different poverty lines between 1990 and 2015. So there's been some upward mobility in East Asia and Pacific. As shown above, East Asia and Pacific has been more successful than Sub-Saharan Africa. That's referring to the graph that I showed you earlier. In the fight against extreme poverty, East Asia and Pacific has also seen an expansion of the middle class from less than 1% to almost 1/5, which is 20%, and a rapid increase in the population living between $5.50 and $15 to almost half of the regional population. So again, they're rising. But the report goes on to say, this has not happened in Sub-Saharan Africa. The decline in extreme poverty in the region from around 3/5 to 2/5 of people living in Sub-Saharan Africa translated primarily into an expansion of the population living below $5.50, with the middle class accounting for a negligible share of the regional population. Put differently, 85% of Africans are still poor if judged by the standards of upper middle income countries. So that is the condition, folks, of our brothers and sisters on the continent of Africa, in the sub-Saharan part of Africa, which is mostly black. We're on the bottom in comparison and in relation to every other people group. It's sad. We don't want to hear it, but we got to look at it. We got to face it so we can fix it. There it is, literally. I have it highlighted in yellow. A huge percent of sub-Saharan African people live below $2.15 per day. I saw it when I visited the continent. You know, when I go out of the country, I like to go into the areas where people live. I went to Cuba a few years ago. And when people go to Cuba, they love those classic cars and the colorful landscape and the old buildings and so on. It is beautiful. But the people live on very, very little means. And I had people to tell me that while I was there. I had one Cuban black man to say in his broken English, "You like Cuba?" I said, "Yes, I love Cuba. I really enjoyed being here." He says, "I hate Cuba." And I said, "Why?" And I knew what he was going to say, but I didn't know the severity of what he was about to say. He says, "I live on a penny a day." A penny a day. So now when you compare the fact that most Americans live on a much higher level of income, truth of the matter is most African American people still don't have $400 to $500 in the event of an emergency. So we look real prosperous and real wealthy, but the majority of black people here in this country are broker than broke. Broker than broke. Trying to pay for all this stuff. Why is that? Again, because we own less than 3% of this nation's wealth. So our lifestyles may be better than our brothers in Cuba and Africa, but when you look at everything behind the scene, many of us are just as broke as they are. Now, that's going to do it for now. When we get together, again, I'm going to look at the condition of black men in Europe. We're going to look at the condition of black men in Europe. And you're going to see that black men in Europe are also on the bottom. All right, I am Attorney Augustus Corbett. Thank you for watching. Again, it's hard to receive, but we got to, in order to try to change this, we got to look at it. We got to be exposed to the truth. The scripture says, if you know the truth you know will set you free. So we got to hear the truth. And that's part of my job, bringing the truth to you and erasing any ignorance, erasing any part of your thinking about these issues that is uninformed. All right. And I appreciate you allowing me to do that with you and for you. And please share this video, share our channel with others. I just love black people. I love my people. And I want to see my people rise. I want to see us rise. Now, stay engaged with the election process here. We need to get more of us registered. We need to get more of us voting. A very few number of us vote each election cycle, which means a very small amount of people end up electing folks that they want, and those people end up governing all the rest of us. So don't listen to this garbage about voting the couch. Don't listen to this garbage about letting this election cycle go past to teach the Democrats a lesson and all of that. Get in there and vote, because not only are we as African Americans being attacked by this right-wing conservative cabal of white supremacists led by Donald Trump, but our democracy is also at stake. Thank you for listening. Again, I'm Attorney Augustus Corbett, one half of the Defiant Lawyers. Until the next time, peace.